So now we're going to be talking about viruses. So viruses are also known as cellular parasites. They do not belong to a kingdom because they are not considered living. So if you remember those characteristics of life or characteristics of living things that we discussed earlier, viruses do not have all of those things. That's why they're not considered living. We're going to go more in depth with that in a few minutes. So some examples of viruses are the flu, chickenpox, HIV, cold sores, and there's even some viruses that can cause cancer. And of course, a very popular virus right now is the coronavirus, which causes the disease COVID-19. So the biggest viruses are about 1/100th the size of a prokaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells are bacteria. They don't have a nucleus or all the organelles, so they're considered the smallest cells. Vaccines are a weakened or inactivated version of a virus that can be injected into your body or even sprayed, like as a nose spray, into the body. But they're not strong enough to actually cause the disease, but they are strong enough to cause your immune system to develop antibodies against it so that if you were to get the actual virus, you could fight it off much easier. So a vaccine doesn't mean that you won't get it. It just means that if you do get it, it won't be nearly as severe. So this is a picture of chickenpox. When I was growing up, there was not a vaccine for chickenpox, so I had to get it the old-fashioned way. I remember I had it when I was in, I think, second grade or first grade. I was pretty young, and I actually have a few scars from the chickenpox. Anyway, it's very itchy. It's a very itchy virus. That's really all I remember about it because I was pretty young. But I do remember staying home from school and all that. But this is a picture of chickenpox. Now they have a vaccine. This is a picture of, this one is a picture of a virus that can affect a plant. So the kind of point of this is to show you that animals are not the only ones that can be affected by viruses. And then here you have a cluster of flu viruses, which of course we hear about every year. So the reason why viruses are not living, because they do not do these things. Now, if you recall from earlier in this same PowerPoint, we talked about the characteristics of living things. And you had to have all of those characteristics at some point in your life. So one of the things that viruses do not do is they never grow. So a cell is going to grow at some point in their life, even a bacteria cell. Before they divide and reproduce, they grow. And of course, as humans, we grow from teeny tiny babies into adults. You might not grow your entire life, but you do grow for a portion of your life. So all living things have to be able to grow at some point, and viruses never grow. They also never develop. You can think of development as like learning things. Okay, so I mentioned before, learning how to drive is probably some way that you're developing. Kids, they learn how to walk and talk and feed themselves and different things, ride bikes. So that's all development. So viruses never do that. They also do not obtain any energy. So they don't do anything with food. So you eat food in order to get energy. Plants take in sunlight and make their own food so that they can use that food they made in order to obtain energy. Viruses, they don't use energy in any way, form, or fashion. They don't eat, they don't do anything with food. So that is one of the characteristics of life, which you also might have heard called metabolism, that they do not do. Another thing that viruses do not do is they do not reproduce on their own. If I have one virus and another virus and they get together, you don't get baby viruses that way like you would with animals. So viruses cannot reproduce on their own. They have to have a host cell. So normal, like animal reproduction, you would generally have two of the same species, like a dog. This kind of dog and that kind of dog. Dogs are still the same species, and they would mate and you would get babies. Well, like I said, you can't have two viruses and then mate. You have to have a host cell. So we're going to talk more about viral reproduction and go more in depth on that in just a minute. Another thing that they do not do is maintain homeostasis. They don't have any kind of stable internal environment because their environment depends on the host cell that they are inside. So, viruses do not maintain that stable environment because it's the host cell maintaining the environment. And then lastly, they're not made of cells. All living things must be made of cells, and viruses are not made of cells. So they are not considered living. So this is very important for you to know. You'll be seeing this again. So this is another picture of the flu or influenza. And then here are some warts. Obviously this is not a common case of warts, but this is one type of viral wart. Pretty graphic. That didn't work just right. Okay, so what that's supposed to say is viral classification and where their names come from. So if you're following along on the Word doc, then this should already be typed for you. And I would recommend following along on that Word doc and typing in your own notes for you to refer back to. Anyway, so viral classification and how they're named. So the type of cells they affect can sometimes be what's used to name the virus. So for example, the adenovirus is a common childhood virus that affects the adenoids in the throat. Diseases that they cause, the poliovirus causes polio. Some of the viruses are similar, so they're given a number as part of their name or even sometimes a letter. So you've probably heard of flu A, flu B, or hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis C. So because the viruses are very similar, they're given a number or a letter as part of the name. So one type of virus, if it affects a bacteria, it's called a bacteriophage. So we don't want none of that. So viruses can infect plants. They can also infect animals and even bacteria in the form of a bacteriophage. Viruses have either DNA or RNA in them, so they can evolve or mutate over time. That DNA can change or that RNA can change over time and create a new strain of virus or different type of virus. This is why every year they come out with a new flu vaccine, because the flu is a virus that rapidly mutates and changes. So they have to make a new vaccine to fit the new flu that's going around. This is also why you might get more than one strain of the flu in one flu season. Here's an example of mumps. One of the things that people in Mississippi do before they begin school, before you go to kindergarten, is they get vaccines. So the MMR vaccine is one of those vaccines. That's what it was called when I was young. But anyway, I think that they've even added more to it. So it's one shot that has measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. These 3 diseases alone killed so many children and before the vaccines were developed worldwide. So the vaccines for these have really almost eradicated those diseases. But recently there have been some people who have been choosing to not be vaccinated, so we are seeing a resurgence of those cases. So here's a picture of mumps. This is smallpox. You might have heard of it before in history class. This is mono. You might have heard, it's a mononucleosis. They call that the kissing disease, or if you drink out of the same water bottle sometimes. So viral structure. Viruses are going to have an inner core of nucleic acids. They either have DNA or RNA, but never both. Your cells are going to have both, but viruses will have one or the other. So you have RNA viruses and DNA viruses. Some RNA viruses enter the cell, and then they use the host cell's ribosomes to make new viral proteins. The poliovirus is an example of that. Then you have retroviruses. Retroviruses basically make the process of protein synthesis go backwards. They use an enzyme called reverse transcriptase, and that uses viral RNA to make a DNA copy, a virus DNA copy. So normally the virus wouldn't have RNA, and so it's going to make DNA. Normally in protein synthesis, DNA would make RNA and never the other way around. But in retroviruses, then the viral RNA will make DNA. So that's really abnormal for cells. Retro is backwards, so this is very abnormal for cells to do. But a retrovirus will make the cell do that. So then that newly made viral DNA then integrates and connects to the host's DNA. And then they go through and make more viral RNA, which then makes viral protein. So this can be a lengthy process. HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, is a retrovirus, and this is the virus that causes the disease AIDS. So it's a retrovirus. And this is where you get into an incubation period. A lot of people are talking about the quarantine if you're around someone that has COVID-19, because the incubation period may be anywhere from like 2 to 14 days. Now they're talking about now it might be 10 days instead of 14 days. But viruses, like if I'm exposed on a Monday, then I take some of the virus into my body. I'm not going to start having symptoms until that virus replicates enough to affect enough cells to cause a response in my body that is much more widespread. So basically, by the time the virus by the time you're showing symptoms of the virus, you've got millions of viruses in your body. So that's where the incubation period comes in at. So the capsid is the protein part, and it surrounds the nucleic acid. And how that protein is arranged can help determine that shape of the virus, the type of cells that virus can affect, and how it infects the cells. Okay, so how this protein capsid is shaped and arranged around that virus, around the nucleic acid, will basically determine what kind of cells that virus can affect. So back to COVID-19 and the coronavirus, there's some studies out there that say that children don't have, the younger the child is, then a lot of the children that are real young, they do not have receptors for the virus, so it can't connect to their cells. Whereas older people, they do have it. That's just one theory out there. Then you have the viral envelope. So some viruses, but not all of them, have a lipid layer that's called the viral envelope. And so it's similar to like a cell membrane, a plasma membrane, but again, it's not a cell, but it's similar to it because it surrounds the virus. So capsid has the P in it, so it's the protein coat. Envelope has the L in it, so it's the lipid coat. So lipid is like a fat. So this is a picture of just a general virus. Not every virus looks like that. Here is a picture of the coronavirus, or what causes COVID-19. So if you notice, it's got multiple proteins on it, and then it also has the envelope. And the coronavirus is an RNA virus. Okay, so anyway, there's another protein, sorry. So it does have this appearance. So it's different viruses can have a very different appearance. So anyway, I really like this picture because it shows you the envelope, the little lipid layer, and it shows you all these surface proteins. So all those surface proteins are going to help this virus attach to certain types of cells. And what I mean by that is, I don't think I've read any studies of, and they don't really totally know everything, but like the coronavirus, it probably doesn't affect your, let's say, brain. The brain has the blood-brain barrier. So I haven't really seen anything where the coronavirus affects the brain, but I have seen where it primarily affects the lungs, the respiratory system, so your throat, your nose, everything going from what you breathe in into your lungs. The lungs are very closely related to the heart. So I have seen where it can affect the heart, and it can even, and those two things, and then it can filter out and affect other organs. But I actually haven't seen anything about it affecting your brain because your brain cells might not have those connectors. Same thing with HIV. HIV affects the T cells. That's a certain type of white blood cell. My brother, if you're in class, then I mentioned that my younger brother had leukemia. He's fine now, but when he was younger, on his 14th birthday, he was diagnosed with what they call T cell ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And so that is the same type of cell that HIV affects, but HIV affects it differently. It's not like a cancer. With leukemia, he had an overproduction of those cells. So, for example, a normal white blood count will be between 5 and 10,000. When you get to about 50,000, you probably have some sort of infection. His white blood count, excuse me, his white blood count was 164,000 when he was diagnosed. And so it's a very much overproduction of white blood cells that do not work right. They're cancerous. And we'll talk more about cancer later. But anyway, my point being that certain viruses only affect certain cells. Like HIV only affects the T cells in the body. That's where it infects. So this is a picture of the HIV virus, which I was just talking about. So we have two main types of viral reproduction. So this is how viruses reproduce. And it's not necessarily in order. You have the lysogenic cycle, and then you have the lytic cycle. So the lysogenic cycle, after it goes through the lysogenic cycle, then it will go through the lytic cycle. But some viruses only do the lytic cycle. The main difference is the lytic cycle kills the cell. Lytic lyse, to lyse, means to like burst, or lysis means to burst. So the cell literally will burst because it's so full of viruses. So the lysogenic cycle will go through, if the cell goes through the lysogenic cycle, it will go through the lysogenic cycle and eventually go through the lytic cycle, or the cell will only go through the lytic cycle to reproduce viruses. So, and I'm saying cell because the viruses are reproduced inside of a host cell. So one way or another, eventually the cell will die, which is not going to make you feel very good if you have that virus. So here is a picture showing the difference between the two. So if you look here, this would be where the cell dies because it burst open, it lysed, and the baby viruses are released. So in the lytic cycle, if you'll start here, you have your regular DNA, which would be your black circle, and then you have your viral DNA. Okay, and I'm using that picture because it's kind of goes for both. It's the only one where they both attach. So in the lysogenic cycle, that DNA is going to integrate into the host DNA, so it connects. So if you look here, you can see how there's both colors. Then the host cell might replicate and make more host cells that have viral DNA in it, and then they're also going to replicate the DNA inside of that cell. And then eventually, it will be triggered. A lot of viruses that can remain dormant could be in the lysogenic cycle. One example of that is chickenpox. Chickenpox virus can lay dormant for years and come back as shingles. Anyway, eventually the lysogenic cycle, it will go into the lytic cycle, where you start making new viral parts, not just new viral DNA, new viral parts like the protein coat and all that jazz. So eventually you get so many viral parts that the cell is so full it bursts. That will kill the cell, and now you've got hundreds of viruses released. All those viruses are going to then attach to a new cell and inject its DNA and start the whole process over again. So the lysogenic cycle, this is just kind of the text version of what we just looked at. The lysogenic cycle is not going to kill the host cell immediately. It's going to kill the host cell after it goes into the lytic cycle. So the virus will insert its DNA into the host cell's DNA, and then it will replicate more viral DNA. The cell will divide, so then you get more cells with viral DNA, and eventually separates off and will begin the lytic cycle. And in the lytic cycle, the virus takes over the genes of the host cell, and that destroys the host cell's DNA, and then it uses the cell and those gene parts to make more virus genes, viral proteins, and it puts together the virus, and then the cell becomes so full of viruses it will burst. When the cell bursts, it kills the cell, and all those baby viruses, not really babies, but all those viruses get released into the body to then start the process over again. So this is just another picture showing the lytic cycle and how it absorbs into the cell and then replicates viral parts. Then they're assembled into viruses, and then it becomes so full that the viruses are released when the cell bursts. So, I mentioned before the only way a virus can infect a living cell is if the receptor site on the host cell matches that of the virus. Okay, so this is why you typically don't get the same virus that your dog might get, or you won't get a plant virus. One example is the tobacco mosaic virus. It only invades tobacco plants. It's not going to get a strawberry plant. So a big thing you need to take from viruses is that they're not alive, the reasons why they're not alive, how they reproduce, and this thing. Antibiotics do not kill viruses because anti is against, bio is life. Okay, so antibiotics are against living things. So they might kill a bacterial infection like strep throat. That's a bacteria. But antibiotics will not kill viruses because the viruses are not alive. So there are antiviral treatments, and they work differently. I do want to say this, that with the coronavirus, they are prescribing some antibiotics because you can get pneumonia, which is like a secondary infection, because your body becomes more susceptible. So you might get prescribed an antibiotic, but most of the time doctors are not going to give you an antibiotic to kill the virus. It might kill something that the virus causes, but not the actual virus, if that makes sense. Here's another picture of the lytic cycle versus the lysogenic cycle. So again, we're just going to start here in the center. I guess we should start at one. Let's go start with one. So first off, this is a bacteria cell. So the bacteria invading a virus invading a bacteria is going to be called a bacteriophage. And so the virus invades the bacterial cell, making it a bacteriophage. So then the DNA, the viral DNA, which is kind of red-pink here, bacterial DNA tends to be circular. It's called a plasmid. So that bacterial DNA and that viral DNA are now together in the same cell. And so if you look at the lysogenic cycle, they connect. The DNAs are going to connect there. And then you're going to replicate more cells with that viral DNA. And possibly it can disconnect. And then eventually it's going to go through the lytic cycle. So coming over here to the lytic cycle, it gets rid of, notice it gets rid of the circle, the blue circle. The blue host cell DNA is digested, and it's destroying it. And so they're going to use those DNA parts to help make new virus parts. And so then you get new virus parts, and eventually the cell becomes so full that it will burst, and all those viruses go find new cells to start the process over. So question for you. Antibiotics would be effective against bacterial pneumonia, the Malarian protist, the flu virus, or viral meningitis. Okay, so you should have picked either A or B, because those are both living things. A or B here. Not a virus, not a virus. actually changed this question on the test to be a little easier. It's like virus, and then I think bacteria. I'm sorry that the question's coming up off a little bit, but I think we can probably see. Which characteristic do viruses possess in common with living cells? They contain a nucleus and organelles. They make their own food. They contain nucleic acids such as DNA or RNA, or they are given scientific names. So what do they share in common with living things? Well, they do not have a nucleus or organelles. They do not make their own food. And we don't usually give them like a scientific name. But they will have either DNA or RNA, and that is in common with living cells. A scientist has discovered an unidentified organism. Cell theory states that which of the following must be true about this living thing. Its cells come from pre-existing cells. All its cells have different functions. It will not be made of cells, or all its cells are considered non-living. Okay, well, I hope you automatically know that cells are living and that it will have to be made of cells, but you probably were between these two. One of the parts of cell theory is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. Now, all its cells might have different functions, but it might be a unicellular, a one-celled organism. So this would not necessarily be correct. So A is your definite answer here. Many scientists, including Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann, contributed to cell theory. Which of the following is not one of the basic tenets of cell theory? Cells are basic units of organisms. Well, that's definitely part of the cell theory. We're looking for what's not part of it. All living things are composed of cells. That's definitely true. Cells can only arise from other cells. That's also true. All cells must eventually die. Cell theory does not talk anything about death, so it is D. An amoeba is a one-celled organism. Cell theory states that which of the following characteristics of amoebas must be true? All amoebas have a globular, undefined shape. Does cell theory say that? No. All amoebas move slowly using a pseudopod. Does cell theory state that? No. All amoebas have organelles called chloroplast. Nope, that would be plants. Or all amoebas come from other amoebas. That's definitely it, because that's saying that amoebas come from pre-existing amoebas. Or all cells come from pre-existing cells. So what this slide should say is cells contain structures called organelles that carry out specific functions for the cell. Which of the following is not true regarding the theory of cells? All living things are made up of one or more cells. That is true. As the cells grow, so does the size of an organism. Cells grow and respond to changes in their environment, or all cells are considered to be living. So hopefully you also think D is true. So let's look at B and C closer. As cells grow, so does the size of the organism, or cells grow and respond to changes in their environment. So which one of these do you think is not true regarding the theory of cells? So if you think back to the characteristics of life, then C is a characteristic of life. Never mentioned anything about the size of the organism growing, so B is going to be your best answer here. So between 15,000 and 18,000 new species of organisms are discovered each year. Cell theory states that which of the following must be true about each new kind of organism? It must be made up of one or more cells. Yep, cell theory states that. Its cells must be able to make their own food. Does it say you have to be able to make your own food in cell theory? Okay, you can't make your own food. Are you alive? Are you a cell? All its cells must perform the same function. Does all your cells have to perform the same function? Your brain do the same thing that your stomach does? No. Some of its cells must include a cell wall. Do y'all know if animal cells include a cell wall? No, animal cells do not, but we're still made of cells. Okay, so our answer is easy breezy A. Cell theory says it must be made of one or more cells. What sort of evidence would support at least one of the components of cell theory? Rocks and other non-living things are not composed of cells. Cells are observed converting one form of energy into another. A microscope is necessary to make observations of nearly all cells. Or the origin of all cells observed can be traced to previous cells. So hopefully you picked D, because this is expressed in the cell theory. It states all cells come from pre-existing cells or previous cells, same thing. The other things cell theory does not state. Those other things may be true in some instances, but it's not stated in cell theory. The cell theory holds true for multicellular and unicellular organisms. Which of the following is not true of cell theory? Cells are made up of one or more cells. The cell is a basic structural unit of all organisms. All cells are considered to be non-living, or an organism may consist of one single cell. This should say organisms, but hopefully this was easy for you. All cells are considered to be non-living. That is not true of the cell theory. This question should say, Theodore Schwann is one of the scientists given credit for the formation of cell theory. Which of the following would not be considered evidence that would support at least one component of the cell theory? So again, you're just looking for what is not part of the cell theory. A cell adjusts in varying temperatures to reach homeostasis. Cells are observed growing and reproducing. The origin of cells observed can be traced to previous cells. Or rocks and other non-living things are not composed of cells. So which one would not be part of at least one of the parts of cell theory? That is going to be D. Cell theory doesn't talk about non-living things. It talks about living. Okay. Metabolism is a characteristic of life at which of the following levels of organisms? So who has a metabolism? An organism, the population, the community, or the ecosystem? Well, hopefully you picked one organism, because like one human has a different metabolism than other humans. Which level of biological organization has a student described in the table? So, the biosphere, an organelle, an ecosystem, or a community. So if you look here, you're going to see multiple species, but it doesn't mention anything about non-living things, so it's going to be community. This is actually not included on your test. I omitted this because we'll be going over this later. But just in case you wanted to know, the answer here is community. Unlike living organisms, a virus requires what in order to replicate? A host cell, nucleus, cell wall, or RNA? Well, hopefully you know that that's a host cell. If cells inside an organism are exposed to the venom of a poisonous snake and begin to die, the next level of organization in the most immediate danger would be okay, so we're talking about cells, and it's asking for the next level. So after you have a group of cells, then you have a tissue. So it should be your tissues are the next level in danger. Okay, what this should say is the student is learning about cell theory in science class, and she applies it to a fern that she's growing in her bedroom. That's a plant. Cell theory states that which of the following characteristics of the fern must be true? A fern's cells came into existence spontaneously. The fern is made up of a collection of cells. The cells that make up the fern are non-living, or the fern is made up of compounds that are not cells. So it's asking what is true of cell theory. So it should be that the fern is made of living thing, of a collection of cells. The fern is living, so that would not be correct. And the fern being made up of compounds that are not cells, the fern is going to be made up of cells, and it definitely did not come into existence spontaneously. So those are all incorrect. One difference between bacteria and viruses is that viruses respond to stimuli, bacteria do not. Bacteria are living organisms, viruses are not. Bacteria require a host cell to reproduce, and viruses do not, or viruses are composed of cells, bacteria are not. Well, hopefully you remember that viruses are not living, but bacteria are. Viruses do not respond to stimuli. Bacteria do. Bacteria do not require a host cell. Viruses do. And viruses are not made of cells, but bacteria are. So B is your correct answer. So this should read, which of the following statements correctly describes the energy use and growth of viruses and bacteria? A, viruses can grow without using energy. Bacteria need energy to grow. B, viruses don't use energy and don't grow. And bacteria use energy and they do grow. C, viruses use energy but don't grow. Bacteria can grow without using energy. Or D, both viruses and bacteria require energy to grow. If you recall, we talked about viruses do not use energy and they do not grow. So B is your correct answer. Which of the following best describes the relationship between influenza and viruses? Remember, that was one of the examples I showed you a picture of. Influenza is a disease caused by a virus. Influenza is a classification of viruses. Influenza is the host cell of some viruses, or influenza is an organelle within a virus. You should have picked that it is a disease caused by a virus, and that is the flu. Which of the following structures is required in order for a virus to replicate? And we've seen this question before. It should be host cell. Viruses can often lead to disease because they promote the growth of healthy cells, increase the rate of cell division, cause cells to break open and die, or remain dormant within the host cell. Well, they lead to disease because they kill your cells. In an animal, which of the following structures represents the highest level of organization? So which is the biggest? The heart, which you know is an organ. The mitochondrion, which is an organelle. Red blood cell, which is a cell. Or epidermis, which is a tissue. And hopefully you pick the heart, which is an organ, because if you put these in order, it would be B, then C, then D, then A. So A would be the highest level, the largest thing. Which of the following characteristics would be used to classify an unknown microbe as a virus? If it contains DNA, has a protein coat, has a cell wall, or is a pathogen? Well, the only one of those that's unique to viruses is the protein coat called the capsid. Cells and viruses can contain DNA. Cells and viruses both can have a cell wall. And cells and viruses both can be pathogens. So, what's unique to viruses is that protein coat called the capsid. Cells differ from viruses, and only cells use genetic material, are microscopic structures, contain cytoplasm, or have a protective covering. So the answer is contain cytoplasms. Viruses do not contain cytoplasm. If you remember when we talked about the structure of viruses, we never mentioned cytoplasm. Both cells and viruses have and use genetic material, either DNA or RNA. They're both microscopic, and they both have some sort of protective covering. Viruses use two different cycles of replication, the lytic and the lysogenic cycle. In what way is the lysogenic cycle different from the lytic cycle? The virus recognizes and attaches to the host cell. The host cell is not destroyed immediately. Viral DNA is replicated along with host DNA, or the virus injects its DNA into the host cell. So it's asking how the lysogenic cycle is different. So it's wanting to know more about the lysogenic cycle and what makes it different from the lytic cycle. If you remember, the lytic cycle, it lyses, so it kills the cell immediately. Think of it like this. Lytic is a shorter word, so the cell has a shorter lifespan. Lysogenic is a longer word, so the host cell is not destroyed immediately. Viruses can be transmitted through air, water, food, insect bites, and direct skin contact. Once a virus gains entry to the body, it invades the host cell in order to deactivate the host cell's defenses, synthesize antibodies for defense, metabolize host proteins and grow, or access cellular processes for replication. So hopefully you picked replication. That's the goal of the virus, is to use the host cell in order to replicate. Remember, it has to have a host cell to replicate or reproduce. Which of the following forms all matter? Hopefully you remember that atoms form all matter. In plants, a group of cells that function together to form an epidermis, an outer layer. The epidermis of plants forms which of the following? An organism, an organ, a cell, or a tissue. Well, if it's a group of cells, then that makes it a tissue. The cell theory holds true for multicellular and unicellular organisms. Which of the following is not true of the cell theory? Cells are made up of one or more cells. Well, that is true. The cell is the basic structural unit of all organisms. That's true too. All cells are considered non-living. Yeah, that's incorrect. So, let's look at D just in case. An organism may consist of one single cell. That's also true. So C is our answer. What is the main distinguishing factor between matter being considered living or non-living? The presence of elements, the presence of atoms, the presence of organic compounds, or the presence of cells. Hopefully that was easy for you. Which of the following characteristics is shared by viruses and living cells? Both viruses and living cells have a nucleus as well as a cell wall, contain nucleic acids such as DNA or RNA, can replicate independently of a host cell, or use organelles to perform life functions. Hopefully you remember that viruses can contain DNA or RNA, the nucleic acids, and cells are going to have both. Viruses will not have a nucleus or cell wall. They cannot replicate independently, that means by themselves without a host cell, and they do not have organelles. So, what am I talking about here? Am I talking about a cell, a tissue, an organ system, or a whole organism? So if we're talking about the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, that's going to be the organ system, the nervous system. So organ system would be your answer here. The viral structure responsible for recognizing specific host cells is, so how does a virus recognize a host cell? A surface protein, genetic material, a retrovirus, or a bacteriophage? Well, what's going to connect to the outside of a cell? The surface protein. Remember, that's the capsid. The removal of a single tree, so one tree, from a rainforest would be the result in the loss of an ecosystem in a biosphere, a population in a community in an ecosystem, or an organism in a population. So you would lose one organism. One tree is one organism. Identify each of the following as a cell, tissue, organ system, or whole organism. So muscle. Muscle is going to usually be a tissue. At the lowest biological level, group of cells that have a similar structure and function work together as, so if it's a group of cells, what is it? Organs within an organ system, tissues inside an organism, an organ system within an organism, or an organism within a population. Hopefully you remember a group of cells is a tissue. And our last question here, identify each of the following as a cell, tissue, organ system, or organism. So bone. Bone is going to be a tissue because it is a group of cells.